press your buttons harder, better, faster, stronger. With proper keybinds, if you ever wanted to play more than one spec and had trouble setting keybinds, you are in the right place, especially if you're a new WoW player. In this video, we will go over how to set up a keybind system that will work for all 39 specs in the game, since I have been using it for over 5 years now. I have to say this for your sake, but the keybinds you will see here are mine. You don't need to set them up the way I do, but I will go over how and why I have them set up this way, so you can play all 39 specs in the game and never have a hard time setting up your keybinds ever again. You can still use a lot of info here if you only play one spec and one spec only, but a lot of the tips here are made to help people who will end up off-specking and playing more classes and have a hard time setting proper keybinds on all of them without having to always relearn things. The way the brain stores information usually is by compartmentalizing it, and yeah, think of it as a file cabinet with drawers. Each drawer is a trigger for your brain to access dozens and dozens of individual files, but it does this one drawer at a time, instead of having to think of the hundreds of thousands of potential files you have in the entire cabinet. Translated to WoW keybinds, by setting up some rules on which keybind goes where, you'll be able to not only have a logical setup that makes sense for your character, but you will also have the same setup for all 39 specs and never have to relearn the position of buttons, since the rules will say that all defensives will always go here, all rotational abilities will go there, etc. You might already be doing that, since it's not a revolutionary concept and WoW players are pretty good at storing and accessing information, since you know, we all play a data-rich MMO at the end of the day. But there are a few things you might find helpful. First, let's talk about hand size. Ha! I'm 5'7", and if I place my pinky on the control button, my thumb reliably reaches the number 9 key on the keyboard, so the keybind setup takes advantage of the buttons I can reach reliably, which is why we will start with the first set of keybinds, the rotational keys. The rotational keys will be from number 1 to 4, and that's because by keeping my hand on the WASD keys, I can reliably hit 4 without having to look at my keyboard. I could hit 5, but it's just far enough out of my way where the likelihood of fat fingering it and missing it is too high. And to use an example, I will take my Resto Shaman and set its keybinds up with you guys throughout this video. Resto Shaman is likely the class with the most amount of possible keybinds, so it's the best choice here. It's also the hardest, I think, to set it up, since if you play the other specs and also want to play any other classes and specs, Resto Shaman has the most crossovers and likely exceptions, which in turn makes it so that if we can set this guy up, we can set any spec up with keybinds. So let's get into it. First, let's put the rotational abilities down. Resto Shaman or no, one of the most important abilities will be Flame Shock, and that goes on 1, with Lava Burst on 2, since they have an obvious synergy. Next up, I will put Healing Surge on 3 and Riptide on 4. These 4 abilities are either my most used or the most important to have immediate access to. Past these 4, I bound keys that are closest to my WSD key, so it would be F and G next, then the Z key, X, C, with Q, E, R at the end, and all have a purpose. Oh yeah, my strafe movement is set to A and D, so that Q and E are free, and obviously all the other keys that have already existing binds in WoW I ignored and redid for myself. I put spec-specific activators like Unleash Life on F and Totemic Recall on G. The Z key can be a key spell for your spec. I will put Frost Shock for my Shaman specs. X is usually my main hard CC, like Capacitator Totem in Resto Shaman's case. The C key will have Spirit Walker's Grace or the equivalent key spell for your spec. And now we get to more important binds. Q and E are what I call consumers or finishers. For Resto Shaman at the moment, they will be Healing Wave and Chain Heal. My R key is usually a mini cooldown or spell that activates stuff in your rotation, so Healing Rain in this case. Now we are done with the first bar. The rest will be slightly easier since they will follow this example. And for this I will be using the shift key modifier. Not necessarily because I need it, although for Resto Shaman you do need it, but because it will make sense in my head, and let me show you what I mean. Just above my 1 through 4 keys, I will have my shift 1 through 4 keys, which I will use to bind main cooldowns, Healing Stream Totem, Wellspring, Ascendance, and Spirit Link Totem. As we move in the bar, Shift F and Shift G are mobility abilities. This means Gust of Wind and Wind Rush for Shaman. Shift Z will be Earthen Wall Totem since it's a Resto specific keybind, while Shift X would be the next hard CC or AoE CC, which is Thunderstorm in this case. Shift C is where I keep my health stone for all of the characters. It's a unique button, so it will remain empty for now. And now the most important section, Shift Q, E, and R. Shift Q and E are my lightning bolt and chain lightning respectively. You can see maybe a pattern here with their non-shift counterparts being healing wave and chain heal. As an example, elemental and enhancement will have these swapped, with lightning bolt and chain lightning being on Q and E. This is so if I off-spec, I can always remember that my Q and E buttons are big Shaman consumers, and depending on my spec, they are either offensive ones or defensive ones, making my Shaman keybinds have some sense and logic for each spec. My R key is primordial wave for all specs, which is yet another mini cooldown. The third most important bar will have the keybinds from F1 all the way through F8, even though my hand stops at about F5. F1 through F4 will have defensive cooldowns. The reason they are all the way up here is because I have to very rarely press them, and I also don't want to press them by accident since they are the worst buttons to accidentally press, with one exception, which is F5, and that is Bloodlust. Since the F keys are physically farther and distinctly different to press, it's hard to mistake them for anything else. You don't want to waste a defensive cooldown and then die, right? Or give your group Bloodlust at the wrong time. An extra button here just for Shaman is Ancestral Guidance on F6. I don't actually press this since I macro it into other cooldowns, but I like having it on my bar since I can see when it gets off cooldown and ready to press again. The other binds here are not important save for two: the middle mouse button, which is the scroll button pressed, and its shift modifier. For Shaman I have Hex here, and on the shift modifier is Lasso. For tank classes, this would have my taunt abilities. For almost every other class, these amount of bars would be enough, but not for Shaman, since Shaman has all of the game utility, and for that we need 2 more bars. And these 2 bars are bound to my mouse buttons. This is a whole other section we can discuss. If you plan on playing more classes in WoW, you will eventually land on one like Shaman that has too many binds for non-MMO mice. You do you, but we strongly recommend you get an MMO mouse for World of Warcraft. For the next keybinds to make sense, I will tell you how mine is set up. MMO mice generally come with 12 side buttons. There are other little clown funky buttons along the sides based on your model, which I ignore since the 12s are the only ones that are consistent across all brands. These 12 buttons I set up to coincide with my numpad buttons. You can do this with the software the mouse comes with, and it differs for everyone, but mine is numpads 1 through 9, and the last 3 are actually the 0 key, the minus or dash key, and the equals key, which are not actually numpad buttons, but keys I never would press anyway, and the reason I have these 3 is that nothing of worth is ever bound here, or nothing at all is ever bound to these. Once my mouse is set up to recognize these buttons, I then bring them to my 2 action bars, with one of them having the normal binds and the other having the alt modifier binds. The alt modifier bar you can likely leave unbound if you like, but for me it stayed this way ever since I was doing arenas with Marcelian and I needed even more keybinds for party frames and arena frames. With that out of the way, in no particular order, the first 3 keybinds will have my Earthbind Totem, Ghost Wolf, and Totemic Projection. The next 3 are Shaman-specific generic buttons like Required Shields, Earth Shield in this case, and Water Shield with Nature Swiftness at the end. As a contrast, Enhanced Shaman will have Earth Shield and Lightning Shields here, while classes like Paladin will have their Blessings here, just to give you an idea of the purpose of these binds. Next three will have helpful totems like Tremor, Poison Cleansing, and Mana totems, and the last three are the most important since they are the same for all classes. On 0 or bottom left mouse button, I have my Dispel, middle bottom is my Kick, and right bottom button is my offensive Dispel or Purge. Last but not least, the Alt modifier bar, with the first three buttons being the same for all other classes as well. The Alt numpad 1 button is my practical mount, which in Dragonflight's case was my dragon riding mount. Alt numpad 3 is my repair mount, and Alt numpad 2 is whatever mount I like most. Now, since all mounts have skywriting, Alt numpad 2 doesn't really have a purpose, so you can just put whatever you want here, likely a second favorite mount. The next three are usually class-specific spells, again, that you press very rarely, like Flame Tongue Weapon, Earth Living Weapon, and whatever leftover shield I don't use. For enhancement, Earth Living Weapon would be Wind Fury Weapon as an example, while Elemental has their new Thunder Strike Ward or whatever here. The next three buttons are also very important since I have my Raid buff on Alt numpad 7, my Resurrect or Mass Resurrect on Alt numpad 8, with Water Walking on Alt numpad 9. The last three are also universal, with my Health Potion being on Alt numpad 0, Flask on Alt numpad minus or dash, and DPS Potion on Alt numpad equals. The reason I have these three here, which may seem random, is that these last three bottom buttons on my mouse are my most used buttons, and it's easier for my brain to remember that position for my thumb and just add an Alt modifier to it instead of just putting them all on the same action bar. These are all examples of how they are set up for me, and you can form your own sections and rules based on how you play. But now we get to the most important part of the video. How do all of these apply to every other class in the game? And I will give an example for most of them where it would seem that they would be different. Let's take the rotational buttons closest to your left hand, which are 1 through 4 with Q, E, and R. On a rogue, these would be the combo point generators on the numbered keys, with the finishers on Q and E, so Backstab, Sinister Strike, and Shiv type buttons with their AoE counterpart like Shuriken Storm on 4, while Eviscerate, Rupture on Q and E, and Black Powder and Secret Technique on Shift Q and Shift E. I can't go into all of the binds for all specs since that video will never end, but I will keep showing you on screen so you can get an idea. For the cooldowns, the best example will be Death Knight, since it's the class with the most amount of offensive cooldowns, I think, particularly Unholy. Shift 1 through 4 will have Dark Transformation and Apocalypse close since you always use them together, with Gargoyle and Army on Shift 3 and 4 respectively, since they are longer cooldowns and rarely pressed as much. Unholy Frenzy and Vile Contagion will be on R and Shift R. This is a good point to mention that you won't always have all of the spells on your bars at once, since one build won't use all of the buttons present. But I have them all binded separately on my bars, so my brain gets used to always using R for Unholy Frenzy and not R for whatever my current build has, which can change all the time. Some people only bind their buttons their current build has, and when they change build, they just replace those keybinds with new ones. Do that if that works for you. I personally want to have all my class buttons on separate keys so that I never confuse or press one accidentally, because I was used to it being a different button on a build before. Not to mention that if a build comes up that uses two binds that you normally had on the same key because you never thought you would ever use them at the same time, your brain will fart. Or mine would anyway. As we swap to more classes like Mage, for instance, you can see that it doesn't need all of the keybinds my Shaman has, so I opt to leave open keys that don't translate the same between specs and classes. For example, I don't have a Z type key for my Mage, and I could put stuff like Frost Nova there, but that's a hard CC, and that goes on my X button on all of my classes, so I kept it on X, with its counterpart Ice Nova on Shift X, since it makes sense. As an example, Fire has only one DPS cooldown that goes on Shift 1. totally opposite from Unholy Decay. But I don't really have a place for spells like Alter Time and Greater Invisibility, which I set up on Shift 3 and Shift 4 since they need to be super accessible. Shift 2 will remain empty, maybe hold a Trinket proc at one point, since Mage is famously a class that can use double unused trinkets that are essentially DPS cooldowns, while for Frost Mage, Shift 1 and 2 would be Icy Veins and Ray of Frost as an example. But Greater Invisibility is a defensive cooldown really, so why isn't it on one of the F keys? Well, simple. Mage has a shit ton of defensives, so there's no more room. And now we come down to what I mentioned, where I want to have keybinds that translate to a lot of classes. Greater Invisibility is a defensive cooldown, but also a stealth ability that lets me drop combat or sneak around. And on Shift 4 is where I keep all of my stealths, like my Rogue Stealth or Druid Prowl. So there I found a common denominating factor between these classes. Paladin is also a good example here since it famously has very few rotational buttons or cooldowns, but has a lot of helpful ones. My red has a lot of empty keys, as you can tell. 2 out of the 4 rotational buttons are passives. With my current build, 1 out of the 3 offensive cooldowns are also passives, Radiant Glory. And it also has the finishers Verdict and Divine Storm with its heals on shift modifier keys similar to Shaman, but most importantly I kept my blessings on the same buttons I have Earth Shield on my Shaman, since Earth Shield is something that I use on my party members, similar to my blessings. And although I have no key totems on Paladin, I do have auras, which go on the numpad 1 and numpad 3 with Pony in the middle. Of course, that would translate to Warrior, where I have defensive stance and the offensive one on numpads 1 and 3 with Leap in the middle. And since we are here, the Q and E keys also change for my tanks, where I don't have finishers, but active mitigations, so Shield Block and Ignore Pain on my Warrior, but Demon Spikes and Spirit Bomb on my Vengeance Demon Hunter, or Iron Fur and Frenzy Regen on my Druid. Let's stop on the Druid for a minute, since besides Shaman, this would be the other hardest class to make keybinds for if you off-spec. Thankfully, Druid retains the stance bar mechanic, meaning that your main action bar changes when you shapeshift. So where I would normally have basic rotational spells on Resto and Balance like Wrath, Starfire, Regrowth, in Bear form I have Mangle, Thrash and Swipe, or Shred, Rake, etc. for Feral. But since Feral is also a rogue type spec, I still have my finishers on Q and E and Shift Q, with mini cooldowns like Feral Frenzy and Adaptive Swarm on R and Shift R respectively, where Rogue would have Flagellation and Echoing Reprimand. So in the end, I try to keep some logical sense between all of these classes and their keybinds so that my defensives are always on the F keys, my raid class buff is always on this alt numpad 7 button, my stance buttons, which are my shapeshift forms on my Druid, are on numpad 1 and 3, since they took Munkin form away from my numpad 2, kicks and dispels also on the same buttons as other classes. Druid and Shaman are the closest in terms of utility type and number of buttons, with the other classes having a ridiculously lower button count that I've opted to keep open to retain the logical sense between these keybinds. And just to cover the most popular class in the game, statistically, Hunter will also serve as the last example for all of these binds to make sense. Looking at the keybinds right now, you will see a pattern, so I will talk about what translates to other classes as well. Similar to Rogue and Druid that have their offensive cooldowns on Shift 1 through Shift 3, Hunter will also have the same, plus its stealth ability Camouflage on Shift 4. Similarly to Shaman, numpad 1 and 3 are root-style crowd controls, while Feign Death is on numpad 2, since it's the only ability of its kind in the game. What you may accurately notice, besides the low button count, is the plethora of pet buttons. First of all, pet attack is bound to my C key, since pet AI can be wonky, and since I don't have almost any finishers, my disengage is on Shift Q, which is the same bind for Vengeful Retreat on Demon Hunter, by the way. But Shift E and Shift R are pet utility buttons. Since my shots and traps are my regular mouse buttons, the alt modifiers outside mounts and potions are pet utility. The whole set of pet utility buttons is on my alt numpad 4, but the dismiss is bounded separately, since on marksmanship and unique beast mastery situations you want to dismiss pets quickly and resummon new ones or not resummon at all, which will be on the next 3 button set that contain a ferocity pet pet for Bloodlust, a Cunning pet for Wild Call to remove roots, also set on the same keybind where Blessing of Freedom is for Paladin and Tiger's Lust for Monk, and lastly a Tenacity pet, which is a Spirit Beast for Beast Mastery. Although the pet ability can be one bind for all of these, it does different things based on the pet you have out, so I opted to have each unique pet ability bounded separately to where it makes sense. Primal Rage is F5, where my Bloodlust is, Fortitude of the Bear is F4, where my defensives are, and Wild Call is numpad 4, which are the same buttons that accomplish the same things on other classes, meaning remove roots or some kind of movement incapacitating effects. This is the essence of having proper keybinds that can make it easier to play all 39 specs in the game. Of course, there are exceptions for each spec and each person playing the spec, but it's easier to have these exceptions when you have a solid foundation for the rest of the situations. As a bonus for sticking this long, this add-on that you see on the screen of the keyboard and mouse you kept seeing on throughout the video is Key UI, and it can also be used to set up keybinds if you want. And speaking of add-ons, the best ones we use in the War Within are in this video right here. You can get our UI and also have specific personal weak cards from this video, so have at it.